Hey guys, Heidi Prieb here. Welcome to my channel. If you are new, we talk about all things personality and developmental psychology on this channel. So we talk about any system of self-understanding that helps you to make sense of who you are and the way that you show up in the world, as well as how you can make sense of the way other people show up in the world. So today I'm talking about a system that was very heavily requested. So I think that I mentioned this system really briefly in passing in another video, and I got all of these comments that were like, I want to hear about the 4 tendencies. Tell me what this system is. So today we are going to be talking about the 4 tendencies, which is a system developed by a woman named Gretchen Rubin. And she gives you the entire layout of this system in her book, The 4 Tendencies, which unfortunately I do not physically have on me. I have it on Audible, but it is a fantastic book. It's a super easy read, and it gives you a lot of insight about motivation. So both how we motivate ourselves and how other people motivate themselves, and what keeps us engaged in the goals or the things that we want to do versus what's likely to keep us off track. So I think that I was talking about this in a video about ENFPs, which is one of the personality types in the Myers-Briggs system. And I've really noticed that within certain personality types, so whether that's ENFP, INTJ, ESTJ, whatever it is, there can be a lot of variation in terms of what motivates people. And I think that people try to chalk up motivation to personality types independently, but I think that the 4 tendencies really come into play here, and they can actually account for a lot of the differences within a certain type in terms of how people are showing up and honoring or failing to honor their commitments. So today I'm just going to briefly go over what the 4 tendencies are so you can start to get an idea of which one might be your preferred style and how you can work with yourself better with that information. But again, I'm going to redirect you back to Gretchen Rubin and her work and her book because it explains it in much more detail if this interests you, so make sure you're checking that out. So what the 4 tendencies looks at is how we respond to expectations. So the 4 categories that you might fall into are upholder, obliger, questioner, and rebel. So the upholder style meets both inner and outer expectations. So what that means is that this type takes very seriously both the commitments that they make to themselves and the commitments that they make to other people. And they're really diligent about following through on both, which might seem like either a great deal or a terrible deal, depending on how you're looking at the system. But I believe that Gretchen Rubin herself said that this is her tendency. So she kind of had a big aha moment, which led her to developing this system when she realized that that was not how everyone else operated. So upholders like to have really clear expectations about what's expected for them, and they also create really clear expectations for themselves when it comes to their own goals. And then they're naturally motivated to follow through on their commitments once they've made them. Now, this does not mean that upholders are just going to blindly do whatever is asked of them. No person has the capacity to follow through that hard. It actually means that they're going to take a lot of care in picking out which commitments they take on, because they know that once they've committed to something, they are going to see it through. So often they can be actually quite analytical and quite creative when it comes to figuring out which projects are going to be worth their time, which goals they want to follow through on, and who they want to collaborate with on these different goals and projects. So I think that if you're coming from kind of the other side of the system, which we will get to, you might look at the upholder tendency to follow through on as many of their commitments as humanly possible as kind of being rigid and like they don't have any creativity, they can't really decide on things, they just kind of have to do the things they said they do for the sake of doing them. But actually the opposite is kind of true. Like if this is your own preferred tendency, you actually feel a sense of freedom through following through on your commitments, because you know anything that I decide on and any goal that I choose to pursue, I'm probably going to see it through to the end. And that feels very exciting, right? That's a pretty autonomous place to be coming from. And I would imagine there's also a pretty strong sense of self-esteem that develops through knowing that you're a person who other people can rely on, right? Because once you make a commitment to someone else, you intend to follow through on that. So that sense of being able to live up to the promises that you make, both to yourself and other people, is quite liberating for this type, right? But where they often get very frustrated is in the realm of dealing with other people, because it can take the upholder quite a bit of time, if ever, to realize that everyone does not operate the way they do. So when someone else agrees to meet an expectation, they're not necessarily going to be as diligent about following through on it as the upholder is. And until they start being aware of these differences, it can actually be very confusing, I think, for upholders to kind of go, okay, well, why are other people not taking their commitment seriously? What is it? Are the expectations not clear enough? Are they lacking information? And they don't always understand that other people are just motivated very differently than they are, which probably kind of naturally leads us to our next type. So the next tendency in the 4 tendency system that we're going to talk about is the obliger. So the obliger meets outer expectations but resists inner expectations. So these are often people who really need external accountability in order to complete their goals, because if they're left to their own devices, they're not necessarily going to feel a natural sense of consistent motivation to hold themselves accountable to the decisions that they've made. So these are the people who might really struggle if, let's say, they're completely self-employed and they don't really have anyone to answer to. It might be people who really struggle to meet a goal if they haven't made that goal public, or they don't have other people who are kind of holding them accountable to working towards it. And if this is the way that you operate, it's really important to point out that there's nothing wrong with this, right? It's not that this is a better or worse way to approach goal setting. It's just that it's really helpful to be aware of this. So if this is the category that you fall into, you probably just want to make sure that when you're setting goals, when you're trying to figure out what kind of work you want to do or what collaborations you take on, you're going to want to make sure that you're setting yourself up for success by making those goals public, by making sure you have people you're answering to, you have deadlines set for you that are external. Because if you're doing all of that work on your own behalf, you're probably going to be less motivated to meet those targets. So I think that the judgment that probably gets projected onto this type quite a bit is that they are people pleasers. And I think there can be an element of that to the obliger, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're people pleasers. They might not be doing this for the approval of other people. They might just really find it easier when other people are providing the structure for them, because maybe they don't like the experience of structuring their own choices, right? I think a certain number of perceivers would fall into that category, right? Where they just want someone else to do the work of structuring things for them, and then they'll show up and do what's expected of them. So in some cases, I think it's just a matter of outsourcing what you don't like. But in other cases, there definitely can be obligers who are people pleasers. And it's important to note that if someone is taking advantage of an obliger's kind of people-pleasing tendency, Gretchen Rubin has this concept of obliger rebellion, where suddenly they will be no longer following through on any commitments for that person. There may even be some spiteful sabotage involved, because if they entered into a certain agreement in good faith, believing that someone had their best interests at heart and vice versa, and then found out that that wasn't true, they will quite confidently assert themselves in many cases and absolutely refuse to follow through on that commitment, right? So this is not a blind adherence to other people's expectations. It's more about recognizing that they are not the ones who prefer to determine the structure of their own goals. And so in many cases, they need to find either institutions they can work for where the structure is already provided, the deadlines are already laid out, and it's just their role to show up and do the work around that. Or it's their job to figure out that if they are going to be, let's say, self-employed, or if they are setting a personal goal for themselves, their best chance at achieving that goal is to make it very public and to get other people on board with it, so that they've now kind of set themselves up for success because they've now made a commitment to something outside of themselves. And that is going to be much more naturally motivating for this style than just trying to stick to a quiet internal commitment. And it is funny because I think that this advice of like make your goals public and have external structure is so commonplace that I think a lot of people might think like, doesn't everybody work best that way? But you'll see as we go on that for some people, having a standard that they're expected to be met is actually demotivating for them. So that doesn't completely, but in some respects leads us to our next type that we're going to talk about, which is the questioner. So the questioner in the 4 tendencies system resists outer expectations and meets inner expectations. So the questioner basically is really comfortable setting rules and following goals that they set for themselves, and they're uninterested in meeting other people's expectations for the sake of meeting other people's expectations. And that part's really important, right? So it's not that the questioner can't be counted on for anything. It's not that they're going to flake out of all external commitments. It's that they are very critical about which goals they're going to set, and their goals have to make sense for them in order for them to feel comfortable completing them. But once they have made a decision to complete a goal, they are incredibly reliable as long as the decision came from them. So just to disclose my own bias here, this is my own tendency in the 4 tendencies system. And I think that when we talk about Myers-Briggs, because I make a lot of ENFP content, I get a lot of questions that are like, how do I stay accountable to myself? How do I complete my goals? How do I follow through once I've made a decision? And I always read those and I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, ENFPs are quite good at doing all of those things. And then I realized that no, it's actually the 4 tendencies at play here. So I naturally follow through on my own commitments because I'm a questioner and I almost compulsively have to do that. Like if I make a commitment to myself, come hell or high water, I will be seeing that commitment through, as long as I properly decided on it. And the decision-making process can take a really long time. The information gathering process about which decision I'm going to make often spans over a period of anywhere from weeks to years. but once I decide I'm going in a particular direction, I'm going there and it's going to take something really major for me to get off track. But I think I've noticed, based on a lot of the comments that I've gotten, that a lot of ENFPs fall into the either obliger or rebel categories. We're going to talk about the rebel next. So you have to be aware of multiple different systems sometimes in order to fully make sense of yourself. And this is such an important one. So the questionnaire can take an incredible period of time sometimes to really figure out what they want to do based on what makes sense to them internally. But once they decide on that, they will see it through. And the cool thing about this is that this can extend kind of accidentally to the way that they show up in relationships as well. And that's a great thing, because no, they're not an obliger. They're not necessarily going to meet other people's expectations for the sake of meeting other people's expectations. But if a questioner decides, let's say, it's a principle of mine, it's a decision I've made to, let's say, always be responsive to my partner's emotional needs, or to always show up at work on time and meet my work expectations, then that will become kind of accidentally an external expectation that they consistently meet because they have internalized a principle around it, if that makes sense. Now, the difference here is that if that stops making sense to them for some reason, they are going to be less likely to follow through on that external accountability. But again, they would have to have a good reason, and they would have to see their principle be violated in some way in order for that to be the case. So dealing with questionnaires can kind of be annoying to many people because it's kind of like dealing with a 7-year-old in many ways. Like, they look at everything through the lens of, well, why would we do it that way and not this way? And they really have to figure out what makes sense to them in order for them to feel committed to a certain course of action, which, again, if you're working with them or something like that, can be frustrating because it can feel like they're slowing the process down. But you can also rest assured that once they figure out what the best course of action is, they really have thought through all possible courses of action, and they will be very committed to following through on the one that they have reasoned makes the most sense. So you can also kind of look at this through the lens of who you're hiring for certain jobs. Like, you definitely don't want a questioner in a position where you just kind of need someone to follow orders and do a lot of different tasks that it's not really important for them to think through, right? A questioner might be better at being, let's say, self-employed, where they get to call all the shots and make all their own decisions because they're naturally motivated to follow through on the decisions that they made for themselves. And it might actually feel a bit painful to them to follow through on expectations for someone else that they just don't think makes any sense. So a lot of this is just about figuring out how to make our lives as easy as possible, right? By setting up our environments in such a way that our natural tendency is able to thrive. And the last style here, which I think that a lot of perceivers in the Myers-Briggs system might fall into, is the rebel tendency. So the rebel resists outer expectations and resists inner expectations. I actually think the rebel's kind of not given enough credit in some cases, at least when I hear people discussing this system, because they're kind of looked at as like the style that doesn't get stuff done, that's unreliable. But I think that the rebel is one of the most creative types in the system because they don't do anything that does not have a point to it. And that leads them into some very interesting paths in life. And B, they bring this kind of zest to everything they do. So if you have a rebel tendency, you are not going to meet other people's expectations just because they told you to. You're also not going to meet your own expectations just because you told you to, right? But this doesn't mean that the things you're doing are irrational. If anything, in an interesting way, the rebel tendency is kind of calculating what makes the most sense and what's the most rational in every single moment. So the questioner is kind of looked at as the type that really calculates their decisions and figures out what's going to work long term. But then once the questioner gets going and once they decide on a given course of action, sometimes they will follow through on it, even in a case where it stops making sense. But because they've made that commitment, they just do something because they said they would. Whereas with the rebel, it's kind of like as soon as something stops making sense, that's immediately when they stop doing it. And this has obvious pros and cons to it. But I just think the rebel's not given enough credit sometimes. And the really fun thing about this type is that they thrive at doing things they are not supposed to do. So a rebel is never as productive as they are like 24 hours after the deadline is passed, right? They are never as creative as they are when someone tells them you can't do this. There's this kind of childlike, and I say that in truly the most intelligent form of the word, enthusiasm and curiosity that they bring to life that is kind of unbounded by conventional rules and agreements, right? It's like they look at every situation through fresh eyes, and a lot of the time what they need in order to be productive is extreme pressure, right? Like this has to get done the next 24 hours. And in that pressure cooker, they absolutely thrive. And that is a really important style to have in the world, right? Not everything that gets done should be done slowly over a long period of time. There is immense benefit from people who can work well under pressure. So a lot of rebels, in order to get stuff done, learn that they kind of have to bet against themselves or other people. Like they have to look at something that is always being done in a certain way and go, I bet I could do that differently in a better way. And that will feel very motivating to them. So they love figuring out kind of the hacks and shortcuts, not because they're lazy, but because they're actually motivated by thinking creatively in that respect. And I think that in her book, Gretchen Rubin also mentions that people sometimes try to use reverse psychology on rebels, but that can backfire because they might deliberately sabotage your project if they catch on to that, because they really do not like being manipulated. So can this be a challenge in work environments? Definitely, but if you are a rebel and you can find a way to structure your life in such a way that you have autonomy over the choices that you're making, and also you can create kind of fun challenges for yourself in the work that you're doing, that is how you're going to produce your most creative and inventive work. And those are the categories that the rebel shines in. So I would guess that you have a lot of people in creative fields who have the rebel tendency. Last thing to note is that you have generally a primary and a secondary tendency in this system. So if you see yourself in one or more of these styles, that's really common. Most of us have one that we default to, and then another one where under pressure or in certain environments, we can lean on a little bit more. So I have questioner as my main, and then rebel as my secondary. So let me know in the comments which of these styles you guys are identifying with. I'd actually be curious if you know what your Myers-Briggs type is and which of the 4 tendencies styles you identify with. It'd be super interesting to see if there's like any correlations or any consistencies popping up. And as per usual, I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves, and I will see you back here again soon.